Okay, this lecture is about emotions and the brain. So we're going to talk about emotions and we're going to look into just a little bit of neuroscience. Here are a couple of books I recommend on emotions and decision making and emotions and the brain. I'm a big fan of Joseph Ledoux. He's done a lot of the pivotal work on the role of the amygdala, and he also writes books that are for a common audience. In other words, not journal articles, but books that I think anybody can read, especially if you've had a little bit of background in psychology. So if you're interested in neuroscience and its application to emotions, I highly recommend this book. We've been thinking about the brain's relationship to emotions for a very long time. I mean, over here on the left we have the image of phrenology, where we could look at people's strengths of not only morality and criminality, but also their emotional states by reading the bumps on their brain, their bumps on their skull. Doesn't really work out that way, but this is really, this is centuries ago, people trying to figure out emotions in the brain. Of course, on the right there is the famous picture of Phineas Gage, who had a railroad spike go right up into his head and into his frontal lobe. And we saw in him a tremendous change in his emotions. No, he didn't die. Of course, that would change his emotions considerably. No, he just became more spontaneous in his rage or in his reactionary reactions to fear or to aggression or to emotions. And we started to know about the role of the frontal lobe and its role in mediating the expression of emotions. So when we talk about emotions, it's often the limbic system, and the limbic system is a very complex, interconnected area. I mean, certainly the thalamus is part of it, but also the amygdala and the hippocampus. Some people put parts of the hypothalamus in there, the cingulate cortex, and even the frontal cortex has been placed into the limbic system because of its strong interconnections with the limbic system. The limbic system is really responsible for, the expression of emotions, learning emotions, fight or flight. And it's also the deeper part of the brain. It's the paleocortex. It's what happens when the frontal cortex or the neocortex, this wrinkly part out here, which is with its conscious thought, fights against some of these parts of the brain that deal with survival or sex or fear, and they can really struggle against one another. Oftentimes the amygdala it wins out. So there's just another couple other versions of the limbic system kind of teased out. I see how some people put in the hypothalamus in there, and the thalamus, and the putamen, the caudate. Now we're getting up into some other areas of the basal ganglia. But think about this as kind of the old survival part of the brain. A couple areas that we really need to focus on, of course, is the amygdala, which we've talked about in other classes, but this is where we make connections of fearful events, but also show the expressions of something that we're fearful of. So we connect things here. Oftentimes very simple stimuli, what we call punctate. That's the word, punctate, for very simple stimuli. This might be the image of a spider, or in a lab it might be ringing a bell and shocking an animal's foot. And the amygdala is the place that they connect those two. The hippocampus is really connected well with the amygdala, but this is for a little bit more contextual things. This is about sort of places, not just a single object, but areas in a room or locations. The hippocampus serves many, many functions, and it certainly is part of learning about emotional events, but I think of it as really learning about more complex stimuli, complex events, and complex emotions. So there is a kind of an interesting drawing of the amygdala. If you do a cross section, you can see the lateral ventricles here. This is the ventral surface of the brain. This is the dorsal surface of the brain. The amygdala sits here in the temporal lobe. Now, here's what's going to happen. suppose somebody has a fear of snakes, or we kind of all have this natural fear of snakes, especially if you've been around other people who fear snakes. Somebody sees the snake, and that information is going to go into the eye, into the thalamus, and back to the back of the brain, into the temporal lobe, for you to figure out, well, that is a snake. But before any of that happens, before any of that processing of what in fact that is, we're going to get some signals down to the amygdala. And if there's enough information, not detailed information, vague information that that's a snake, the amygdala is going to react very quickly. And it's going to cause you to have a fear response. It's going to cause you to maybe jump. This is that survival thing. Okay, Mr. Smart Brain, figure out what it is later, but right now I'm gonna move really quickly. Now this happens all the time. So have you ever been walking on a trail and there happens to be a twig on the ground that's a little serpentine in its look? It looks a little snake-like. You might jump before your brain actually goes, okay, that's just a stick. It's the reason that the fake rubber spider on your shoulder trick works every time, because your reaction is faster than your cognition. So the amygdala is getting a signal very quickly from the thalamus if there is enough information that right there is something to be fearful of. So what's happening with the amygdala? Now this is the stuff that Joseph Ledoux did. He said that the connections of stimuli arrive in what's called the lateral nucleus of the amygdala. The amygdala has several nuclei, and this actually gets a little bit more complex, but if you ring a bell, auditory, and that information makes its way to the amygdala, then other stimuli come to the lateral nucleus of the amygdala as well, such as pain detectors. So here is the connection. The bell is signaling pain in a very Pavlovian way. Then the lateral nucleus of the amygdala sends a signal to the central nucleus of the amygdala, and that sends a signal to freeze, to increase blood pressure, to cause stress, to have a startle reaction. The central amygdala sends signals to the part of the brain that's going to react. So if you lesion the lateral nucleus, an animal can't learn to be scared about things. But if you lesion the central nucleus, the animal won't respond to those things even though they've made those associations. Associations take place in the lateral, and then signals to the brain take place in the central. One of the places that it sends information is to an area called the Periaqueductal Gray. Now you have this aqueduct that goes down the brainstem here, and cerebral spinal fluid moves through there, but around that area is an area called around aqueductal gray. And the amygdala is going to send signals to the PAG. And the PAG is going to cause very fast reactions. Those reactions can be defensive or aggressive depending on what part of the PAD we're going to. The PAG that we're going to. So this is the periaqueductal gray in cross section. There's the aqueduct for cerebral spinal fluid, but the dorsal part, if we stimulate the dorsal part, we're going to have an animal that's going to show what's called defensive reaction. Okay, so if we're looking at the facial expression of cats, or we're looking at the action of a rat in terms of where that animal bites another rat, we've talked about these defensive reactions. That is going to be an activation in the dorsal. So if I stimulate the dorsal, I'm going to get a defensive reaction to this emotional thing. But if I stimulate the ventral portion, I'm going to get offensive. I'm going to get an animal that attacks, an animal that jumps, offensive aggression. Okay? So what I just want to demonstrate here is the connectedness between the amygdala and a part of the brain that has a very fast reaction to this situation, such as a snake or a predator or an animal that is invading your home territory where you have this offensive aggression. Now, the frontal lobe is an extremely important part. We use it for many, many things. But one of the things that the frontal lobe does is it helps to mediate or control all the stuff that's happening in the limbic system. Think of the limbic system as kind of your old brain with not a lot of manners, okay? So, all those deep, terrible little thoughts we have, or all those fears we have, those just want to express themselves. Now, the frontal lobe is going to be sending signals down to the amygdala, sending signals to other parts of the limbic system, very highly interconnected, to help to regulate the expression of the emotions that come from the deep part of the brain, this interrelatedness. So if you think about what happened to Phineas Gage, he had a pipe go right through here, blocking the frontal lobe's ability to stop the expression of emotions. We also see this with people with strokes. If they have frontal lobe damage, they may have a hard time regulating their expressions of emotions in sort of appropriate ways. I mean, really, if we said everything that we were thinking, or if we said everything that we had an emotion to, we probably wouldn't have a lot of friends around us. Well, the frontal lobotomy, which was given to a lot of people, swished around the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe has a lot to do with planning and organizing thoughts. Again, it does a lot of things. But what people with frontal lobe damage in a frontal lobotomy, well, they had a hard time planning behavior, so maybe they had a hard time doing things, but they also had a hard time with that regulation, appropriate regulation of emotions. Here's a syndrome of a damage to the amygdala. It's called the Klüver-Bucy Syndrome. So if you remove the amygdala from a monkey, that produces a few things. Well, the animal stops fearing things. We have a tameness. We can take a feral rat, a very dangerous rat, and remove its amygdala, and it won't show fear anymore. But we also have a lot of other problems, too, that go with it. Indiscriminate dietary behavior. In other words, it's just not eating the food it should be eating. A tendency to examine objects with mouth, with their mouth. We call this hyperorality. Also inappropriate sexual behavior and hypersexuality. Now, Klüver-Bucy Syndrome can also happen to people with damage to their amygdala. Either on one side or both sides can start showing problems of hyperorality, hypersexuality, these kinds of things. It's actually a syndrome. Okay, so we see these this is an example of what happens when the amygdala starts having problems. Here's a couple of other things to connect the brain with emotions. Now, an epileptic seizure is when you have a spontaneous activity in the brain. Now, if that is happening in the motor cortexes, and that wave of motor activity waves across the brain, then you have epileptic seizures, and people will shake, okay? You have what are called grand mal seizures. But what happens if the spontaneous neural activity is happening in the limbic system? This too can spread to the motor cortex for the grand mal seizures, but they really start as a subjective emotional feeling. This is what people call an epileptic aura, a feeling of emotions. Now that might be a feeling of emotional dread or fear or even happiness or even pleasure. But somebody who has epileptic seizures that begin in the limbic system and end or go up to the motor system, that can cause a great deal of damage. If somebody has an epileptic seizure and falls to the ground, they really can hurt themselves. So somebody whose epileptic seizures begin with an epileptic aura, that's more of an emotional thing, and it tells the person you're about to have a seizure, and they can maybe, if they have a chance, to get down on the ground so they don't fall. So it's this feeling that they get before the seizure. It's a spontaneous activity. Sudden sadness, sudden fear, sudden anger. even disgust, like they're smelling something bad. But for a few, it's a sudden onset of euphoria, of ultimate pleasure. It's kind of a weird thing. Take a look at these faces. This is going to tell us a little bit about the part of the brain that's better at dealing with reading emotions. If you look at one face at a time, just look right at the nose, you're going to get a sense of one being sad and one being happy. So which one do you think, when you look just at their nose, do you think is sad? Okay? So if you just look at that, your first impression is sad because this part of the face here is being registered by the right side of the brain, and this side by the left. And the right side is just a little bit better at being in tune with emotions of other people. So you're slightly tuned to that side. If I switch it, you're slightly tuned to that side as well, and you see the person as happy. This goes into this lateralization. We call it hemispheric dominance, where one side of the brain is a little bit more sensitive to emotions than the other side of the brain. And in this case, it's the right side, a little bit more sensitive to emotional expressions. So what about how we make expressions? Well, we can have spontaneous or voluntary emotional expressions. Which one of these two is an example of a spontaneous and which is a voluntary? I mean, sit here and voluntarily smile. Now, granted, you're probably not super happy because you're listening to a lecture. I don't know, maybe you are. But when you try to smile, it's different than if somebody makes you laugh. Somebody says something funny and makes you laugh. We get a lot more activity in the eyes in a spontaneous smile and spontaneous active than we do here. So a spontaneous emotional expression are usually caused by external stimulus, occurs immediately, and the intensity of the reaction is directly related to the event, either sad or happy. I measure spontaneous facial expressions in my lab when people are doing things. They're trying to solve problems, they're making mistakes, and I'm looking at those. Voluntary, well, doesn't require a stimulus. You can smile, just smile, okay? Can occur immediately or whenever you want, and occurs independently of the stimulus intensity. And they are also caused by different parts of the brain. So when we look at the spontaneous versus voluntary, the naturalness of the smile, the spontaneous, has a lot to do with what's going on here, in the frontalis muscle, in the orbicularis, the eye muscle. Okay, and so these are really telling us a lot about the spontaneous smile. Also, a muscle over here, the zygomaticus, is telling us about the naturalness of the smile. And the part of the brain that's involved in involuntary has to really go down deep into the brain and get involved with the limbic system. Gets involved with the limbic system, such as the caudate and the putamen and the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmentum and all these areas. Let's look at a different picture. I'm not going to need you to know this, other than to say that involuntary motor activity of expressions on the face are going to affect the motor areas of the brain. These are the motor areas of the brain. They're going to go and you're going to have an expression of emotion. But they're getting influence from all these areas here in an area called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, which is highly interconnected with the limbic system. Deep down in the brain. Here's the motor cortex out here, and here's all this basal ganglia activity. So if you're going to have an involuntary smile, it's going to be induced by these emotions that are really registered way down in here. Voluntary, however, doesn't need that. All we need to do is use the frontal premotor cortex, the primary motor cortex, all up here in the cortex to plan for it and to do it. I plan on smiling, so I think about it and I lift my cheeks, I lift the corners of my mouth, and I smile. We don't need to go down into the basal ganglia. Okay? And those are very different reactions. They'll also produce these differences in microexpressions. Okay, now we get back to the James Lange theory a little bit. What about voluntary facial expressions? What can they do? Can they trick the brain? Can they trick the brain into thinking that the limbic system is involved and therefore you should be feeling those expressions? So, the idea here is if I sit here with a frown for a minute or two, will I become sadder? If I sit here with a voluntary smile, I look stupid, I got a voluntary smile, will I trick the limbic system to think, well, I'm getting feedback that he's smiling, he therefore must be happy. So here's a quick experiment. It's kind of a fun one. I always think this one's kind of fun. People were shown cartoons, and participants either physically suppressed or enhanced facial expression in the zygomaticus, that part next to the cheek near the corner of the mouth. They did this by holding a pencil between their lips. Here, put a pencil between your lips. I'll wait. Okay, you look kind of silly. That kind of crunches the zygomaticus down. But if you hold a pencil way back at the back of your teeth, that forces the zygomaticus up and it enhances the smile. So, two groups simply looked at a cartoon and said, well, how funny is that cartoon? That's the question. And if they're faking a smile by putting the pencil in the back of their teeth, do they find it funnier than if they suppress the smile by holding it between their lips? And a control group held the pencil in one hand. Here's a cartoon. How funny do you think this is? Okay, that's kind of funny. You'd find it funnier if you had a pencil in your mouth for a minute that went way back into your teeth. See? Either forcing the smile or suppressing a smile. These people found the cartoons funnier, and these people found the cartoons less funny. And this kind of reminds me of running marathons. Okay, so I've run 8 marathons so far, and I've not enjoyed a single one of them. But I don't know. I like training for them. I like doing them. I'm a very slow runner. And so I'm reading this book about training for a marathon for one of my first marathons. And one of the things they said is, okay, at the 20-mile mark, you're going to hit the wall. They call it the wall, where you don't have much sugar left in your system. And you begin to get a little depressed and you don't like being out there. So what you can do is put a stupid smile on your face. Just lift your cheeks, your zygomaticus, just smile while you're running through those last miles, maybe for a couple miles, just to have a stupid smile on your face, and it will actually elevate your mood. I'm not sure if that worked. I tried it. I didn't feel any happier. I was still very tired. But you can also kind of see around you who's read that book, because some of them have a really stupid smile on their face on the 20-mile mark. I don't know. Give it a try. If you ever feel the blues, you're a little depressed, try to fake a smile and see if you elevate your moods. Okay? So here are the results. The mean funniness rating in the lips, in the teeth, and in the hand. They found it funnier. The people in the lips, they gave it a 4.2. People 5.2, they just found it funnier. Maybe there's something to that. So, does it make you happy that this section's over, or are you sad? I think it depends on if there's a pencil in your mouth and where it is.